I've been documenting John Brown's letters. I've collected not the actual letter, but I've collected copies of every letter that is extant, that survives. There's no evidence at all of insanity. What there is evidence of is a deep religious faith, a deep love for family, a deep love for country, and a hatred of slavery, and a belief in human equality as an aspect of his Christianity. That's all that comes through. Everything else is details about farming and animals. And when he writes about slavery, the whole family understood that. I mean, he doesn't need to preach to the choir because he reared his children to hate slavery, and they did. Even when they didn't practice his religion, many of them didn't practice his Christianity, they all kept up the family religion of hating slavery. Let him speak for himself. In an 1857 card of introduction he wrote, he described himself as an earnest and steady-minded man. So this is John Brown telling history. I'm an earnest and steady-minded man. In other words, I'm very sincere about the business of fighting slavery, and I'm very steady-minded. I'm consistent. That's how he defined himself to people he was getting to know. Who he was really a child of the post-Revolutionary War era who came of age in the antebellum. You could almost, the arc of his life is really the antebellum period. So when he's a child, we're in the post-Revolutionary era. There's much more optimism about the end of slavery, even among anti-slavery families like Brown came from in Connecticut. By the last decade of his life, the whole idea that slavery was going to fizzle out or become obsolete has completely disappeared because the slave power has amped up every effort to try to make slavery the thing. And so abolitionism actually geared up. Political abolitionism was born in the 1850s, and John Brown grew with that. So he was always an anti-slavery man, but he himself grew and changed. So when he was younger, he saw slavery as something that might be able to come to an end reasonably. But by the 1840s and 50s, he had come to the conclusion that slavery would not respond to anything but a big stick. And he wasn't talking about killing slaveholders, but he was talking about the necessity of using force if necessary. So therefore, he arms black people, even before Kansas, even, is going back to 1850 when the fugitive slave law was passed. Not unlike what's going on today with ICE agents, he is arming black people in Springfield, Massachusetts, forming an organization that might be sort of the forerunner of the Black Panthers, and talking about, so he's a man who believes in just force used in a measured way. He values human life. He's a very devout Christian of the Protestant, Congregational, and Calvinist stripe. He's very much proud of his ancestry in the Pilgrims and his Puritan ancestry, his Protestant ancestry. These are things that are very important for him. He was a little disdainful of Roman Catholicism because he was a Protestant of the antebellum period. When he was in prison in Virginia, a pro-slavery priest came into his jail cell to visit him out of nothing but well intentions. And John Brown chased him the heck out, said, "Get out." And he chased him out not only because he was pro-slavery, but because he was Roman Catholic. So he was not, was a man who was a part of his times. He had his foibles, he had his limitations. As a parent, of course, he married as a young man. He lost that wife after 12 years, remarried a young woman who had a bunch of other kids. A lot of his children died. He went through a lifetime of burying children. I can't remember the number now, but he lost over half of the children that he had. As a young parent, he was a harsh disciplinarian. As an older parent, he talks about it in his letters. He'd grown to, lament the fact that he had been such a harsh disciplinarian, and he became more of a person to reason with his children. So again, a very human figure, very passionate about his faith, but his faith in action. He really believed that, to use a quote from a New Testament book, faith without works is dead. And so if you're going to be a Christian, you're going to have to act that out in preserving what he called the great family of mankind, the great family of man. And for him, to fight for the great family of man in the most immediate sense meant fighting for black freedom. But it also meant when he went out to Kansas Territory, he would use his surveying skills, which he learned himself, to try to protect native territories. And he and his son sometimes forcefully ejected white squatters from Indian territories. Now, admittedly, John Brown was part of the whole wave of white people coming into North America in the first place. So it's part of the problem. But again, we are all part of a problem for somebody. And particularly when you're talking about white supremacy, every European, in a sense, represents a problem in a broad historical brushstroke. But in the specific sense, he's conscious of that. His father is conscious of that. His father was his greatest influence, an abolitionist, a Christian man. And as a family, they worked the Underground Railroad. Even before it was actually, it was only called the Underground Railroad after you started to have real railroads. What did you call it before that? Well, John Brown had called it the Subterranean Passway, a term that he later on applied. But I believe that's probably a term that the family had used in the 1820s and the 1830s. And we know that John Brown even says it in a letter. He said, I've been working on the Underground Railroad since I was a boy. This was a lifetime. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't a white liberal, do-good project. It was a passion of his, what he considered a calling. And so I would also say this was a man who lived in a time. Today we have careers, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in the 19th century, people had what they called vocations. A vocation was, what am I called to? What am I made to do? John Brown, at a very young age, realized his vocation was to see slavery destroyed. The only difference was, as the conditions of the country worsened, his fire built higher and higher. His methods had to change. Once he saw that slavery was not going to surrender, that in fact had an insatiable appetite for expansion and for its own brutal, selfish ways, he knew that some measure of force was going to be necessary. Now keep in mind, John Brown, as a Calvinist coming out of the Protestant Reformation tradition, believed in the sinfulness of humanity. So he was not shocked by the behavior of slaveholders. There's a scene in the family story where one of the little daughters is talking bad about slaveholders, and be quiet. You have to understand the way they were brought up. They don't know any better. So he was not a man who just wanted to kill slaveholders. As a matter of fact, he never simply sought to kill slaveholders. But what he did understand was, as a community, as a collective, as a body of people, they were committed to the violent suppression. There's nothing more terroristic than slavery in the 19th century. Nothing more terroristic, as we all know. You can't have families. You can't allow these people to be educated. They can't have marriages. If they have their own marriages, you can break them up at will. They can't rear their children. They can't keep for Lincoln, it was about, you shouldn't live off of the wages of somebody else. And that's true. It was stolen black labor, but it was also stolen black life. It was black bodies owned. John Brown despised this first and foremost because he believed that all humans were made in the image of God. This was his credo. And so whatever your religion, whatever you are, you're a Jew, you're a Muslim, you're a Buddhist, it doesn't matter to him. He also, by the way, as devoutly evangelical, and we can talk about evangelicalism, especially today, Lord knows, but as devoutly evangelical as he was in his own terms, he had no problem marching with people who had different religions or no religious views if they were willing to fight against injustice. So he had this way about him that was open to people. He was a good neighbor. He was the quintessential good neighbor to humanity. And the tragedy is he's been painted as the vexing problem of our nation's memory, when in fact the most vexing figures are the moderates, the hypocritical, two-faced politicians, and the compromisers. They're the ones who really vex humanity. It's not John Brown. The reason why John Brown vexes the mentality and the memory of this country is the same reason that in the Hebrew annals of the Old Testament, as Christians call it, why the prophets were such a problem to the kings, because the kings wanted to do what the hell they wanted to do, and the prophets were there to say, no, you can't. And John Brown was, in some respects, a cultural prophet to the nation.